Hey everybody, I'm Katallina, and today we're here to talk about episode 7 of Failure Frame. If there was a recurring theme in today's episode, I believe that would actually be the idea that people can sometimes tell a lie by not saying anything about something, and we see a lot of that happen in this episode. This episode was interesting in that it was an episode where we seem to be in a transitional space where we're kind of moving between different situations that the characters are exploring, which in part made it a bit more scattershot and a bit harder to follow, but which at the same time gave us several different points of view or ideas that are going to likely be important going forward. The first thing that we realize as we watch the episode is that the men who have gone to look at the tomb where we were in the beginning of the anime when we got sent down into that place people generally don't escape. These men were looking at it and they are questioning whether somebody might have escaped, and ultimately the leader among them seems to conclude that nobody's going to believe it even if we tell people that this happened. This thing is designed in such a way that this is not something that occurs, so we're not going to say anything. This is an idea called a normalcy bias, and it happens to people all the time, and it was interesting to see it used here. It's the idea that something bad isn't going to happen because bad things don't happen, which of course on a smaller scale in people's lives is something that would be insane to believe, because we all face random problems and challenges on a day-to-day basis. But because our lives are relatively normal and stable, we tend to be either unable or unwilling to buy into the idea that something much heavier and more drastic might happen, in part because we generally don't want it to, and in part because it generally doesn't. The next thing that we see is that when we go and talk to Eve Speed, the cheetah or leopard person who is fighting in the Colosseum, we're trying to get information from her about the Witch of Taboos, and she doesn't outright lie to our face, but she kind of slips past us, and had Seras not been able to recognize that had happened, we likely would have been missing something. It was interesting to see that it was someone other than Touka picking up on something like this for once, because while I do like the fact that he's generally very perceptive, having it be made clear that Seras is like that as well, it's good because it means that first off, they both have personal agency within the context of the story, and it also means that they are evenly matched to each other. They have their own unique skills and abilities, but they share certain things in common. And given where this story seems to be headed, that's going to be important. It's also interesting because it shows that this character doesn't instantly trust us, which, given the kind of world that we are in here, and given the fact that this character is the kind of character that they are, and who has likely experienced some incredibly harrowing situations, that makes perfect sense. The next interesting thing that we see in this episode is the fact that it's becoming more and more obvious that there is some kind of attraction between Seras and Touka, and I think that it was handled really well in the scene where they decide to share a room at the inn. We didn't quite get the one bed trope. There were 2 beds in the room, but they were sharing a room. I think it shows several different things, and I think there were a couple things here that were done in a way that was interesting and different. One thing that I noticed right away is the fact that it's actually Seras who seems way more into him, and we actually see her at the point of sniffing his clothes when she's washing them, which she didn't actually get previous consent to even wash the thing. She was just doing that, which I mean in and of itself is a nice gesture, but I mean, holy crap, dude, she was sniffing his clothes. I mean, you give a blanket to a puppy so that it has its mother's scent. This was just weird. I mean, I know it's something that I've heard of happening in anime before, but I think it's actually the first time I've actually encountered this directly, and it was really funny to see it from a female perspective, because this is something that we usually see from or accused of being from guys, so it was interesting to see the shoe on the other foot, or on the only foot in my case, because yet again, this is something I haven't really seen go on in a story personally up until now. Another interesting thing about this overall situation is the fact that Touka doesn't sit there and try and imply that he's some kind of clueless person who is oblivious to the fact that Seras is seemingly interested in him, nor is he some kind of saint who is somehow not into her and just going to ignore it. Rather, it's the fact that he is so focused on his revenge that anything that could be going on between the two cannot go on right now because he simply does not have the focus for it. That was an interesting twist on how this kind of thing normally goes. There was also the situation where they utilize some of the soup stuff that Touka can bring out of the bag, mixed with some herbs that Seras has, and they mix it up and they get the wrong one. Instead of getting one that's going to help them sleep, they get one that makes them like hyper aware, or possibly even like some sort of like semi-aphrodisiac. And that was absolutely comical, and it definitely helped ease some of the tension and mood within the story, because the majority of what's been going on here has been quite serious. Jumping over to what's happening with the goddess and her allies at the moment, we see that not everyone necessarily trusts the goddess and the kingdom that she serves in the same degree that our heroes that are not Touka have gone to doing for the most part. We see that the goddess not only manipulates the people who are coming to the other world through this hero program, but also the people in various kingdoms, because we see someone kind of backhandedly questioning some of the stuff going on with her. And we see the reality that this demon king seems to weaken people from the other nations and force them to rely upon the goddess's nation. I have this strange sinking suspicion that maybe this goddess has something to do with the repeated return of this demon king, and that she's actually benefiting from his presence. I don't know whether I'm right on that. That's just a hunch on my end as a writer, but it's certainly something worth considering and thinking about. The last thing I want to talk about before I go is what happens when we go to the Champions Coliseum at the end of the episode. We find out that Eve is not actually working to free herself, but rather that she succeeded in having enough money to do that as of 2 years ago. Instead, she's been working to try and free someone else, and that's actually why she is still going into the Coliseum and risking her life. We also find out that this is going to be her last match, and as such, based on rumors that we hear about the Duke of this area, it's very possible that she could lose her life in this bout. That might sound really cruel and cynical and unfair, but if you think about it from a logical perspective, given the kind of scumfuckers who would actually have people fighting inside of arenas as slaves or mercenaries to begin with, it becomes much less surprising. One of the most practical things you could be doing in a situation like that is making sure that if something is done being used, that it is properly disposed of. That sounds really cold, but you think about the alternative, people getting out of these arena or slave contract situations, getting together potentially, forming rebellion and taking it down. The best way to prevent that would be to make sure that once they're done, they're dead. So I can definitely see that being a problem for Eve. Fortunately, we see that Touka and Seras are planning to help her in some way or another, and it's likely going to come to pass that there is going to be some kind of alliance between the three people, and hopefully that will lead to something where Eve is not destroyed and the person she is trying to protect hopefully will get out, especially if it's a kid, because that kind of stuff just makes my blood boil. There is very little that makes me more angry than that kind of shit. Anyway though, overall I thought this was a pretty good episode. As I said, it was transitional, so it wasn't necessarily the best episode of the season, but we did learn a lot. But those are just my thoughts. I'd love to know what you guys are thinking, so drop a comment below and let me know, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. See you later. Bye!